or reclaim. Then it would not be eligible for the exclusion. Okay. So here we have another example. Spent fixer is fortified and sold. What do you think? Fortification is reclamation, again. Okay. Here's an example. Ink is removed from a printing press and is blended with other ink to make a new color. Is that used as an ingredient in an industrial process? Is that substituting for ink? Is that fortifying the ink to make it usable? What is that? Is it possibly excluded? Any thoughts? You think it's reclamation because what? Well, what's being reclaimed?
What are you separating out?
Well, it sounds just like removing it from the press. So here's what I think. Is this used as an ingredient, or are they just blending this at like less than 1% just to get rid of it, right? What do we not know? We don't know how they ordinarily make ink, and we don't know what color they're making and how they ordinarily make this color of ink, right? If we had the additional information, and that's how they normally make that color of ink, that would probably be used as an ingredient and it would be excluded. However, without this information, we can't really determine that it is excluded. All right? Yeah.
So I understand the question about if they're using it at less than 1% is a sham. But if they're using it all up in aliquots of less than 1%.
Okay, they're using it all up. But the point is, what is it doing in the recycling process? So let's say they're putting 10 gallons in each batch. They're using all 10 gallons because that's what's left over. Does that 10 gallons lend a valuable and credible purpose to that process or to that blend? Or is it just along for the ride?
So it has to be effective.
It has to do something, right? Ingredients perform a certain function in a process to make a certain outcome. Right? And if you're just...
So if they needed less than 1%.
And you have that information, that's how they always do it. That's perfect. Then it's excluded.
Adding it as 1% and then adding 99% of a new product
Right.
similar to it, then it's sham.
It's just a way to get rid of it. Yeah, no. The classic examples are, well, the Chinese drywall, right? I have all this sludge from my air pollution control device. I'll just mix it in the feed to the drywall, and we end up with a bunch of acidic, toxic drywall, right? Or making plywood and blending, making 1,000-gallon batches of resin, and I put 20 gallons of used oil in that resin. Nobody sees it. It's just gone, but it doesn't really do anything in that process that, that's legitimate. Do you have a question?
Yeah, this is one thing. So if it's, let's say, adding 1% doesn't affect the quality of the product that much, and they're saying that, oh, because I don't want to generate waste, I'm just putting it in there, and it doesn't really matter for me, so that's still sham recycling.
That's still sham recycling. And we'll talk more about sham later. But it comes back to that, what is recycling in general idea earlier? There has to be some beneficial use, some positive outcome out of these steps. All right, so what do we see here in these couple of examples? Especially with the sham question, is it legitimate recycling? Okay, and often you have to make the judgment call on whether or not this is legitimate recycling. Okay, but more importantly, we saw in these examples for B1 and B2, there can be no reclamation. Okay, fortification included, none, none, none. If there's reclamation, you can't apply the B1 or B2 exclusion. And lastly, we saw from the enforcement perspective, you have to ask questions, get the facts. All right. So now let's look at B1, B2, and B3, right? So I just said no reclamation, no reclamation, no reclamation under B1 and B2. But when we look at B3, it says material is returned in the original process from which it was generated. without first being reclaimed. Well, doesn't that kind of open the door that the material could be reclaimed later or down the road? So what does that mean, without first being reclaimed? If the material is returned as a substitute for a raw material feedstock and the process uses raw materials as principal feedstocks. Okay? So what happens is you'll have primary processes that are furnaces, right? Perhaps I'm melting or smelting an ore concentrate to make a metal ingot or a metal pig, right? When I apply the recycling exclusion to that scenario, here's a legitimate manufacturing process. The way an ore is processed to make the metal, I'm intentionally separating the bad stuff or the unwanted stuff from the metal elements themselves, right? That looks like reclamation. Okay? So sometimes in the industrial process, it looks like reclamation, but it really isn't reclamation. Okay? But it looks like it. A furnace is a classic example. So what EPA is saying here is, it might be okay if it looks like reclamation in the process, as long as it's not really reclamation. And the way they do that is by adding all these other words here. If the material is returned as a substitute for raw material feedstock, and the process uses raw materials as principal feedstocks, okay? So in the same example, if the smelter or the furnace was a secondary smelter, okay, it's taking scrap iron and scrap steel as a feedstock, okay, and reclaiming those materials. That looks like waste management. That doesn't look like normal industrial manufacturing from raw materials, okay? Here, this requirement that says the process itself ordinarily uses raw materials as principal feedstock, it's saying it has to be a real manufacturing process in the first place, not a waste management process. Does that make sense? So sometimes under B3, it might look a little bit like reclamation, and that might be okay. All right, so now we have B1, B2, B3 kind of in our pocket. Let's look at this example. We have paint sludge that's used to make cement, all right? So an employee adds a chemical to a wastewater that helps remove paint particles, overspray particles from the wastewater, and flocculates it out, basically. Then that resultant paint sludge, the flocculant, is sent to a cement kiln, and it's used as a material in the cement making process. So what do you think? Is this use as an ingredient? Is this use as a substitute? Is this return to the original process from which it produced? B1, B2, B3? Possibly. I'm not saying it is, but which one could it possibly be? Anybody?
It's not added in there for intended purposes.
What's that?
What's the intended purpose to add that chemical in that process? To make cement, or is it to remove the...
It's to remove the paint. It's a flocculant. So what does that mean? Huh?
By reclaiming it?
It's reclaiming? Okay. What does it need to be reclaiming? What we need to know is in the second bullet here, is the liquid a hazardous waste to begin with, right? What if this is a very dilute wastewater and it's not hazardous? So then, this concept of reclamation, this concept of use or reuse, this definition of hazardous waste recycling doesn't even apply at the point he's adding this chemical, right? It's not a hazardous waste yet. So if the first hazardous waste is the sludge that comes out, that step of adding the chemical really isn't in the equation, is it? Yeah. But if the wastewater were hazardous, yeah, then clearly that step of adding the chemical would be a reclamation step. All right? You see that? So this basically is not B3. It's not going back to the original process. I think we could all agree on that, right? But it could possibly be B1 or B2. Any questions on that? Okay, let's try another example. Here we go. B1, B2, or B3. So I have a distillation fraction. So not the entire stream coming off, but one fraction coming off a distillation column. okay, and it's produced by reclaiming solvents, one fraction of that mixture is used, blended as a feedstock to make a different solvent mixture. Yeah. What do you think? Possibly B1, possibly serving as an ingredient, right? That's the first thing it looks like. What about B3? Is that possible? We don't know if it's going back to the same process that originally produced the solvent blend.
Well,
Right.
different solvent mixture.
It's a different solvent mixture, but is it the same process?
Is distillation and reclamation?
It is, but if that reclamation is part of the process, then it could be okay. Right? And then we need to know, is it serving as an ingredient or feedstock? Okay. Anyway, we don't have enough information, but hopefully we start to see how that might work out. So now we're going to move on. We talked through B. D is basically the same as B, except as Diana pointed out earlier, there's some allowable treatment or allowable reclamation allowed under D, okay? In general, these slides are going to re-emphasize the point that under 25143.2b, you can consider RCRA or non-RCRA hazardous waste, as long as there's no reclamation. Under D, it's non-RCRA hazardous waste only, all right? Here are some of the allowable forms of reclamation: filtering, sorting, sieving, grinding, separating, without heat or chemicals, okay? pH adjustment, viscosity adjustment. What do those words really mean? Filtering, sorting, sieving, screening. Let's take a look at some examples. I already said that. So in this example here, we have tiles, okay, that are broken up and then sorted before recasting them in a process to make new tiles. What do you think? Could this be B or D? Well, it could probably be D, right? The sorting, separating by, we don't know in this example, but by density, separating by size, separating by color, separating by chemical constituent, that's reclamation. That's separating a good from a bad or unwanted from a wanted. So that's reclamation. But under D, this type of sorting could be allowable, right? So as long as the material were non-RCRA hazardous, this might be okay. So what do we want to know? Why are they breaking them? How are they being sorted? Why are they being sorted? Okay, those are the kinds of questions you would have to ask. Okay, here's another example, similar example. We have pesticide containers, they're plastic, and they're chopped up to make plastic regrind. Oops, wrong way. What do you think? Could that plastic be excluded? Could those containers be excluded? Huh? Well, let's presume they're hazardous in the first place, but yeah. First off, if the container was used or reused as is, i.e. as a container, well then we wouldn't have this treatment step, this reclamation step, right? In that case, the container might be excluded. Here, we have this treatment step or grinding step. The plastic, is used to make new plastic item. Okay, so we're recovering the plastic value from the container. Okay, and that step is reclamation. The question is it simple sorting, sieving, grinding type of reclamation? And possibly you could look at this chopping or grinding or cutting as allowable reclamation under D6. Does that make sense? So we're stretching grinding quite a bit there, aren't we? but that's the idea. All right, let's look at another example. Here we have a bunch of aerosol cans with their contents, okay? And we're gonna shred the cans, okay? Filtering, sorting, sieving, shredding, grinding. We're gonna shred the cans, and in the shredding process, we're gonna screen out or sieve out the contents of the cans and blend the cans to make a product. So what do you think? Could this be B? No, because we're reclaiming the contents from the can, so that's clearly reclamation. We're not going to allow it. But is it an allowable form of reclamation? Anybody?
Let me understand. You have aerosol cans with something in them.
Right, so they're not empty, so they are hazardous. If they were empty, they'd be empty and we wouldn't be asking this question.
Putting aside the 25-250.12 aerosol can management rules for a section, just looking at
Well,
this point.
yeah, I don't want to follow those rules. I want to be at URM. I want to get out, right? So this goes to the extent of how far people might stretch. What bugs me here is I don't know what the product is, and I have no idea what possible legitimate product someone can make by mixing all these things up, right?
Because if the shredding is done to remove the contents, then
What?
if the shredding is done in order to remove the contents,
Mhm.
then
Well, the shredding with, do you?
Barely. I can barely hear it.
So if the shredding is done in order to remove the contents, then it's not included.
It's not excluded. Why?
Because then you're reclaiming what's inside, or you're separating it from.
What you're saying is this shredding really shredding, right? This is the way I look at it. It's not shredding the material so that I can use the can in some way. The ultimate purpose behind this shredding step is to get the contents out. So I'm telling you, the regulator, this is shredding, it's allowable. And you're looking at the law and saying, I'm not so sure about this. Does this fit within the kinds of allowable reclamation that they, yeah. And I tend to agree. Again, where I would go with this one is what product are you making? How is this legitimate? Because they don't say here, and I have no indication that someone could actually make a legitimate product out of this process.
Well, how do you define product? Because if they are taking the shredded material, baling it, and selling it as aluminum for introduction into steel manufacturing or aluminum, well, that's their product. It's not something you can put on your desk. It's not something you buy at Walmart.
But now they're reclaiming metal. That's the recycling that's going on.
Okay.
Yeah. So now I have a bigger thing in front of me, and that's a reclamation process. The purpose here, the recycling that's going on here is reclaiming metal. End of the line. So you're done there, right?
And that reclaiming of the metal would involve heat, which is not allowed under one of these reclamation steps.
And presumably other chemical steps. So we're only allowing simple sorting, sieving, filtering, grinding.
But that's all they're doing. All they're doing is grinding.
But you look at the whole recycling process. Okay. So that's the key. You have to look at the whole recycling process. So
It doesn't stop at their door when they
no,
put the truck.
no. Although they may have those blinders on, in their mind, it might stop at their door. That's not the whole process. All right. So any questions on those examples? No? We'll look at more as we go. You want me to keep going? Sure, I'll keep going. Okay, now we're going to look at some on-site recycling. Okay, and on-site recycling, there's two provisions that we've talked about. There's the on-site recycling exclusion in 25.143.2 D1, and then there's an exemption in 25.143.2 C2. The nice thing about both of these provisions is they allow reclamation. Okay, so you would use these provisions when the material is getting recycled on site and it's not use or reuse. Okay, under D1, the statute simply says the material can be shown to be recycled at and used at the site where the material was generated. All right, that's it. Okay, where it says recycled, that means either used or reused or reclaimed. So it could be either type of recycling. All right. So in this example, a material was used, still in its original container. It became dried out, okay, but it's still usable. Water can be added back to the product, reconstituting the material, and then it can be used on site. So what do you think? Could that fall under this? Material can be shown to be recycled and used at the site where generated. Yes, it's okay. It could be excluded, right? Sure. Dewatering or adding water, rehydrating, are forms of reclamation, but reclamation is allowable under D1, so that's okay. Okay. Another way to look at this is you're recovering or regenerating a usable product from something that was not usable. Okay. But this can be okay under D1. Okay. In this example, I have a spent solution, but I can make it into a new solution. So I add a different chemical to my spent solution, and now I can use it for a totally different purpose on site. What do you think? Could that be excluded? And the answer is yes, this could be excluded. All right. This could fall under D1. A common example of this in car washes, they'll reclaim and reuse water on site, sometimes for different purposes. So they'll start out with a loop that does the rinse, and the water will get real dirty, and they'll add chemicals, flocculants. They'll switch that water to the front of the process where it could be used as the wash water, and then they'll add new water to make up for the rinse water loop. Yep. Okay, here's another example. A solvent, let's say they were doing furniture stripping or something, gets all gummed up, and they strain the solvent prior to using it over again. All right. Would that be allowable? Yeah. Now this is straining, right? That's filtering, sorting, sieving. So this could even be 25143.2 D5, but here it's on site, so it's easier just to use those provisions. All right. Here we have two examples of solvent stills on site. Okay. As long as the material is non-RCRA hazardous and it's distilled and used on site, it could possibly be excluded. Okay. One of the problems that happens with these types of units is that often you'll find manufacturers out of state selling these types of recycling units. And out of state, they'd have different requirements, or the material is just not regulated at all. And you'll find that the units lack secondary containment or lack other provisions that are required under California law. People buy them, they get delivered, they unload them, unpack them, and start using them. And they don't realize the nuances in the law, and they find themselves in trouble when they were trying to do a good thing by recycling. So, all right. But this can be excluded. All right, here's another example. We have a waste mixture, and different components in that mixture are separated, and one component of the mixture can be reused. So this is an example like an air wash or a shot blast unit or a sandblast unit where you separate the paint chips from the sandblast grit. All right. Again, if it's non-RCRA and it's reused on site, this could be excluded from regulation. Okay. Again, sorting equals reclamation, separating equals reclamation. Okay. And these examples are common. What happens when the material is not non-RCRA, but it's being recycled on site? Okay. Oftentimes what happens is you can't use the D1 exclusion, but you can get the 25143.2 C2 permit exemption, all right? And this can be for RCRA or non-RCRA hazardous waste. It's not an exclusion, it's just an exemption. The material is still a hazardous waste and is still subject to the generator standards. All right. 25.143.2 has some requirements that go along with it. Okay. The main requirement is that the material is used at the same location. The other requirements are that the material meets the generator accumulation standards and time limits. Okay. So the handling of the material is still regulated. The material is still a hazardous waste. Okay. In this example, casting sand is treated at a foundry to remove clay binders. Then the metals, to remove clay binders and metals. And then the sand is reused on site at the foundry. So what do you think? Could that be exempt under 25.143.2? Let's say the RCRA are at G008 levels. Yep.
I have a facility which has, they have a wastewater. For the nickel, it is exceeding, it is becoming a regular, not regular. Chromium, it is becoming a regular waste. Then what they do the distillation of the water, and the water then goes through the osmosis process, and then becomes a DI water process. DI water, and the DI water is used into the facility again. So that will be under the permit exemption.
Could possibly fall under this permit exemption, yes.
Why you are saying possibly?
Because I don't know from your scenario, is it all being managed in accordance with the hazardous waste generator standards during all those steps?
Yeah,
So do all those tanks meet the hazardous waste standards?
okay.
Okay.
Then it will be just exempt from the permit requirement.
Right,
It will still follow all the requirements of the district.
that's correct.
Thank you.
No, okay. So those are two examples of on-site recycling. Yeah. Again, here, it must meet the generator standards, must meet the time limits. All right. How about a plating wastewater that's recycled on-site? This is just like the example you just gave, in a wastewater treatment unit, and then the water is reused on-site. All right. And the answer is yes, this could qualify. So they avoid the PBR, they avoid the permit, okay? That doesn't mean the material's not regulated. Yeah. A note of caution or a point to make here is that as with the subsection B exclusions in B1, B2, and B3, when you're applying the C2 permit exemption, you have to apply it with RCRA equivalency in mind, okay? So the temptation often is to just look at state law alone, state regulation alone, and come to a conclusion that a material is either exempt from permitting or otherwise excluded from regulation entirely. And you can sometimes come to outcomes that are not allowable under the RCRA regulations, okay? Because the state and federal systems don't match up entirely. So whenever you get into that situation, you should always go back and check the federal regulations and make sure your outcome is consistent with RCRA, okay? An example would be recycling something on site that involves combustion, okay? So you may decide under C2 that could get a permit exemption, but if you go backwards and you find out the reason this is allowable under RCRA is because treatment in a tank or container exemption, you might then find out, well, combustion is not allowable treatment in tanks or containers. And you know, my answer here isn't consistent with RCRA. You know, a lot of times this happens because some of these requirements in RCRA, like treatment in a tank or container, aren't written down anywhere in the regulations themselves. They're in guidance documents or federal registers. So you have to be careful. All right, 25.143.2 is not referenced, 25.143.2 C2 is not referenced in 25.143.9, okay? That means that ERM labeling, business plans, and secondary containment standards don't apply to the C2 exemptions. And I have here why not. And the answer is these things are still hazardous waste. They're still regulated, okay? So when you talk about ERM labeling, no, that's not applicable. This stuff should be labeled as a hazardous waste, either a hazardous waste container or a hazardous waste tank, okay? The business plan requirement doesn't need to be re-invoked because the material is already a hazardous waste, so it's already a hazardous material, so it's already subject to the business plan. And secondary containment standards already apply under Chapter 11 if they're a LQG.